and thank you for inviting me. I'm always happy to come across the ditch, and it's nice to be back in Christchurch again. So I want to start my talk with a couple of maxims that we all understand to be true, or hopefully we all understand to be true. I hope I'm preaching to the converted here. And the first is that food safety is not negotiable. We do often take this for granted, but it is something that we have to continue to work on, and we ignore this at our peril. The second is that food safety equates to market access, and I'm sure we all know plenty of examples where failures in food safety have closed market access, and I'm going to give you a lot of those today. And the third one, of course, is that safe food equals premium prices. Now, Australia and New Zealand both produce very similar products. We have similar quality and food safety standards, and we target similar export markets. And we definitely trade on our reputation for producing safe food to be at the premium end of that market. So what I want to talk to you today is not only the opportunities but also the risks that we place at that market if we don't deal with our food safety. And I'm hoping to convince you that on the whole, food safety is a pre-competitive space, and we could really benefit from working together in this space. So I want to also put a bit of context around the investment that we put in our markets and the way those markets are constantly changing. Change is a good thing. Change creates opportunity, and change is what we capitalise on to make profit, which is why we have our food industries that are so vibrant and strong in Australia and New Zealand. The change in the Asian market is a really good example around this, particularly in the last decade. And we've invested very heavily in both of those, in the Asian markets in particular, building our brand. We have investment on a national scale, and you can see brand New Zealand there. We can see the rather retro Australian brand, and as normal, we're a few steps behind you. We've obviously got a new brand under consideration. We also invest on the sector scale, I've got the laser. We've got Australian pork, true Aussie beef, and Australian wild abalone, which is very clearly targeted at China. And on the domestic scene, we've had a very successful campaign domestically about Love Australian Prawns. And of course, there are hundreds of examples of companies making investments in their markets. So the challenge for us, I guess, is that with change also comes risk. And we need to be dealing with this risk appropriately if we want to keep those market access and we want to keep our ability to capitalise on those opportunities open. I've just got some examples here of where food safety incidents have caused market closures on a rather large scale. The first one, Hussein and Dawson in 2013, was published soon after the whey incident here in New Zealand. Some very big dollar figures there. They're in, I believe they're in US dollars, but I'll have to check that one. Hundreds of millions of dollars. And then there's some more recent ones from the big events that we've had in Australia over recent years. There was also a report put out in 2016 by Alison et al. In Australia that was targeting what is the cost of foodborne illness to industry in Australia. And that was $1.25 billion per annum. 770 million of that was actually borne by individuals and companies, and that's dealing with liaising with consumers, food recalls, and even dealing with lawsuits around foodborne illness. So that's a really significant cost. The other market access issue that we work with quite a lot at SARDI is inappropriate food safety regulations, or what we call technical barriers to trade. This is more about trying to reopen a door that's been locked, and it is often much trickier. So we spend a lot of time at Codex striving to keep that door open and to try and avoid this situation in the first place. I'm going to be providing you with an example in abalone a bit later on. We're also currently working with the Australian and New Zealand industry because we have a trade barrier for canned abalone into China, where they have sulphite restrictions that prevent trade on that level. So we're working there too. I've lifted a quote here from Meat and Livestock Australia just to give you an example of the size of this issue. Trade barriers, technical trade barriers, are actually an awful lot more common than you would suppose. And MLA, in their current strategic research plan, puts a lot of effort into dealing with this. They expect to provide new market opportunities or cost savings of $100 million by 2020 by investing in that space. So, that's a pretty significant figure. If we want to understand where our risks are, we have to understand how our markets are changing and what the drivers for those change are. And a really big one for me is climate change. Climate change has been around for quite some time. It's pretty well understood in Australia and in New Zealand what the impacts are going to be and where the hot spots are going to be. For things like increased temperature, increased drought, more storm events, increased flooding. And we need to rethink all of our food safety risk profiles on the back of that. What does increased temperature mean for our growing areas, for our processing environments, for our transport chains? When I think of increased storms and increased flooding, the first thing that comes to mind is a more spread of fecal contamination and chemical contamination. What does that mean for our irrigation supplies, for our growing areas, even for our potable water supplies? Can you imagine if our potable water supplies are threatened, what that means for our processors? That can be a really significant impact. And it's particularly true for seafood, especially along coastlines, where that fecal contamination and chemical contamination is directly input into our growing and harvest areas. Now, at the risk of sounding really old, I want to tell you a story that happened to me at the turn of the century when I was very, very, very young. I spent the whole day at a workshop in the centre of Tasmania with the seafood industry. It was a time where climate change was quite new and the Commonwealth Government had a lot of money to help industry prepare for this new threat that was on the horizon, and we were encouraged to think really big. So we had the whole coastline of Australia closed to algal blooms. We had Vibrio outbreaks that occurred normally very much a tropical or warm water scenario. They were occurring everywhere in Tasmania associated with the shellfish. And we had animal diseases that would be wiping out whole sectors. And we all left at the end of the day feeling very smug that this wasn't going to happen in our lifetime. But sure enough, in 2012, we did have a harmful algal bloom that covered the whole east coastline of Tasmania from the northeast corner right down to the southern tip. The biotoxins from that bloom were first discovered in mussels, a shipment of mussels in Japan. And Japan suffered what I could only call a knee-jerk reaction and closed import of all Australian bivalve shellfish. It took South Australia and New South Wales 6 months to reopen that market, and it took Tasmania 2 years. It also affected lobster and abalone, $6.5 million in direct losses to the seafood industry from that one event. And then poor old Tasmania in 2015, they were the centre of the marine heat wave that you can see here. I noticed it also affected parts of New Zealand. But sure enough, along came the Vibrio outbreaks. And then a few months later, we had the oyster herpes virus that wiped out 40% of stock in some growing areas. So climate change is real, climate change is here, and perhaps the seafood industry is going to be the earliest hit, but it's certainly not going to be the only industry hit. And we really need to revisit those risk profiles that we actually are getting quite comfortable with and think about what that might mean. There are other drivers for change, of course, and some of these, as Nicola pointed out, are actually drivers for opportunity. And this is one of the things that I was really pleased to hear about with Nicola's talk, was that this risk and opportunity do come together, and we should be looking at them together. Market and consumer drivers are quite a big change, a big disruptor in the markets. I like to think of them more in terms of opportunity, but we need to be making sure that we're covering our risks at the same time. So if you Google market trends at the moment, you'll find any number of sites that talk about trends in the food industry. And I like to think that that's because there is a lot of opportunity here. If you look at some of those locally sourced, environmentally friendly, you probably think not all of them are related to food safety, even things like ethical food. But when you really think about ethical food, And the example that always comes to mind for me is in the poultry industry. I'm assuming in New Zealand you have the same issue with cage eggs that our consumers do in Australia, and there's a move away from cage eggs into free-range eggs. But that means a different production system. And with a different production system comes a different food safety outcome. So we need to be prepared for that. We need to be a bit proactive about that. The healthy and free from desire at the moment, we all know that often translates into reduced salts and less preservatives. But these things actually have a technical function in our food. And if we're going to be reducing things like that, we need to make sure that we're increasing something else along the processing chain to adequately deal with those food safety risks. I'm really interested to hear the packaging discussion that's going to be happening this afternoon. Convenient and plastic-free. Talk about two opposing market trends. How are we going to achieve that? That's a real conundrum. And then, of course, extended shelf life, which is actually one that's driven mainly from the retailers to try and reduce cost and wastage. And that has some very obvious food safety implications. But all of these are really opportunities. And in countries like Australia and New Zealand that have such good food safety records and such good regulatory support systems, we should be able to take advantage of these opportunities by being on the front foot and dealing with the risks. I'm going to change tack here, and I'm going to talk to you about Safe Fish, which is a program that I run in Australia. Hopefully most of you have heard of Safe Fish. It comes under the Fisheries Research and Development Corporation, and it's really there to provide technical advice to support Australia's seafood trade and market access. It's a program that started nearly 10 years ago now, so it's had quite a long history in terms of research projects, under the banner of the Australian Seafood CRC. And it came on the back of several market access closures back in the late 2000s, where the CRC then recognised that there was a real hole in capability in Australia in this space. And so they pulled together this program called Safe Fish. The value of Safe Fish is in its unincorporated partnership. We have an independent chair, that's Anne Aston. We involve all the regulatory bodies. We have Food Standards Australia, New Zealand. We've got the Department of Agriculture Export Standards Branch and their Trade and Market Access Branch. We have funders like the Fisheries Research and Development Corporation. A range of industry bodies are represented, so we cover the whole value chain. And of course, we have the research institutions as well. We've been growing over the time that we've been around. We're now totally dependent on industry funds, which are equally matched by government funds. And we have significant in-kind contributions from both industry and government. We have a relatively small budget. It's around $280,000 per year, but it's the same value in kind. And I think that just goes to show the level of engagement that Safe Fish has with its stakeholders. It's a very significant in-kind budget. We work in three main areas. The first is technical input into food standards and guidelines that are under development. And these are both domestic and international. So we help with submissions to reopen markets, as well as working very heavily in the codex process. We do a lot of proactive work around researching new hazards or emerging hazards, risk analyses. Capability development is quite big on our agenda, and training. And the capability development is for not only the seafood industry, but everybody who supports the seafood industry as well. Regulators, service providers, sometimes even sewerage authorities. Anybody that can have an impact on the seafood industry, we would consider worthwhile upskilling. We also work with food safety incident response, and that's generally providing technical support. We don't do the incident response ourselves. We are more of an independent third party, if you like, a trusted voice of science. So here we might do things like provide fact sheets for industry, maybe determine how these risks are managed elsewhere in the world. What's the best response for this? Can we help with providing information for media outputs and things like that? Sometimes it's just as simple as which lab will undertake this analysis for us. You can see the range of in-kind contributors and cash contributors that we have, and that grows all the time. The backbone of Safe Fish is the prioritisation process. With the very small budget that we have, I think we do amazing work, and we're very, very proud of what we do. But it means that we have to work very strategically. We have to think very carefully about where we put our resources. So we have a process where we identify and rank the current and emerging food safety risks or issues that we see for the seafood industry. We're scanning issues all the time, but we only run this big process every third year. It does take us about 3 months to prepare for it, and I was interested in judging our process against Nicola's report there. And I think it's probably a mash of her two processes. It's data-driven and it's expert-driven. It's certainly neither one or the other. We rank these risks according to an agreed set of criteria, and we use this ranking to determine what our work priority is going to be. So if I just run through this process quickly, we look at a whole range of background data. You can see a very big list of things there. I've bolded the ones we find particularly useful. I think the direct contact is one that we can't understate, and it's not just with the seafood industry, it is also with our other stakeholders. We work very closely with regulators in both the health, primary industries and food areas. You can see, for example, I've got the AusFoodNet epidemiological data there, and AusFoodNet is fantastic, but they are under-resourced, and unfortunately they are running about 4 years behind in getting out their reports. And so we have to have a very good communication with the health people as well, because they can give us more up-to-date information about what the current epidemiology says. You look at the food recall data there, that's a really good one from FSANZ, that is always up to date, and it tells a very clear story about what risks are happening that industry currently aren't managing particularly well. From that scanning, we then get a whole range of potential issues. Now, at that point, this is where the expert opinion comes in. Our secretariat will sit there and go, yep, that one's definitely an issue that we have to deal with, or no, that's actually more of an extension activity. We'll put that into our extension pile, or perhaps we'll just take this one off the list for the minute. It's really not a big issue. Somebody else is responsible for it, or it's just a quality issue rather than a food safety issue. So we'll end up with this list, and then we provide a very comprehensive issue sheet around that. What are the risks? What are the opportunities? We take that to a full-day workshop with an independent facilitator and our partners, and we discuss each and every one of those issues one at a time in terms of trade and market access, in terms of public health, what's the regulatory impact, what's the economic impact, where are our reputational risks. This is one that we all like to avoid, but with social media we cannot avoid that nowadays. We have to be really open and honest with ourselves about this. And then we end up with this beautiful rainbow risk matrix. And essentially, we take essentially the lowest number in the column and we put it down the bottom, and that gives out our priority ranking. We then take our overall, all information up to this point, I might say, remains confidential. But post this point, we take that ranking and we distribute it as widely as we can. We hope that other researchers will pick up our high priority issues. We hope funders will fund our high priority issues. We like to know who else is working in the space so that we might collaborate and leverage off that. So I want to move from here just giving a few examples of how this works in practice. We talked about the harmful algal bloom off the east coast of Tasmania. It was a very novel type of bloom. It's incredibly toxic. It turned the way we manage risk on its head. Shellfish were going from no detect of biotoxins 1 week to over the regulatory level the next. And the times that we have for our analytical processes are longer than a week. So by the time you've taken the sample and oops, it's over the limit, the shellfish are absolutely eaten and gone. So this was a real issue that was causing big headaches for both industry and regulators. We had 24 recalls in 5 years. 5 illnesses, and one exporter walked away from an $800,000 export market because of the inability to control this risk. The system was definitely not working smoothly, and we had to re-engineer a solution. So we had some researchers in Tasmania that took a really good look at what are the commercial rapid test kits available on the market, and they tested each of them against the shellfish in question, and they found one that looked like it could work. So we took our very small amount of funds, $15,000, and here we are. We talked to our partners, you know, where are the opportunities in this? Our Department of Ag, who is one of our partners, says, well, we've got a research grant open at the moment, package assisting small exporters. Let's put it into there. So we put this problem into the package assisting small exporters. We got $50,000. We took it to the company producing the test kit. They gave us another $35,000 worth of kits for free. And we ran a validation program against internationally agreed protocols for that. And we worked with Cawthorne and another of other biotoxin laboratories around that space. We had some great results, particularly for oysters. We published it internationally, and we decided, yes, this was a real goer. So we put another $200,000 grant into the package assisting small exporters, which we won, and we used it to implement this test in industry. This was quite a large program. It had a big training component with it. We developed appropriate quality assurance, quality control procedures to allow industry to take ownership of this risk and manage it in-house. So the really good thing about this is not only are we developing capability that way, but we're actually growing a mature seafood industry that is actually taking acceptance of their risk and trying to manage it themselves, understanding that the regulatory system at the time isn't just quite flexible or fast enough to keep up with the problem. So that worked very well. We also ran some workshops with the regulators to see how they might take up this rapid test kit in low-risk scenarios. The test kit is now in use by industry. The export markets have reopened. We're hoping, but when the regulators pick it up to demonstrate free-from status, they'll be able to save $500,000 per annum for the industry just in testing costs. Last year was the first year that it operated in full. It wasn't a big bloom year, so I wouldn't say it was a hard test, but we did have closures. We didn't have any recalls and we didn't have any illnesses, so great win. The next example I want to talk to you about is more about opportunity and enabling industry to take up opportunity. So this one was back in early 2010, where our stakeholders recognised the opportunity for packaged seafood. Now, seafood's one of those commodities where a lot of people don't buy it because they don't know how to deal with it. It's messy, it's smelly, it leaks in the car on the way home and all of those sorts of things. So they saw packaging as a real opportunity for them. And there are a lot of small players who wanted to get involved in packaging, players that might not normally have a lot of food safety expertise in-house. So we recognised, yep, it's a great opportunity, but that also comes with a risk. So it's definitely a space for us. We applied for another grant from the Australian Seafood CRC, and we used that to develop an industry guide that identified what the potential hazards were, what the regulations around that were, how you might possibly deal with that, and then also included a guide for shelf life determination, because if you have packaged food, obviously you need to have a shelf life associated with that. And then we ran some great workshops in Melbourne, and I'm assuming you would have some facilities like this in New Zealand, but the multi-vac system in Melbourne is just simply a really big warehouse with a number of different packaging machines in it. So this was a BYO seafood event. Industry came with their seafood and they could put it through the different packaging machines and they could see how it looked at the end of it. They had talks at the same time about the different benefits that came with different packaging, the different quality considerations, the different food safety considerations that came with that. A few years later, we had another call from industry stakeholders saying, well, look, you know, our markets are pushing us for extended shelf life. That means that we we want to push past the normal boundaries. So here we approached Food Innovation Australia to fund a partnership between Safe Fish and CSIRO, and we pulled out another guide about extending shelf life safely. All of these workshops included industry, researchers and regulators, because we wanted to build capacity across that whole board there. I know I've got 5 minutes left, so I'm going to whiz through this one. This was an EU market access closure. So this has really brought home to us the importance of working in codex. So in 2007, the EU closed the Australian market for abalone on the back of a discussion that happened in codex that said they wanted abalone to comply with bivalve regulations. Now, bivalves are filter feeders and we tend to eat them raw. Completely different risk profile to abalone that are grazers and are eaten cooked. So we ran a whole series of research programs and technical work around this, mostly funded by the abalone industry, value of probably around about $800,000. But it enabled us to go back to Codex with a very strong set of arguments, and we worked closely with New Zealand around this. We were able to put up a strong evidence base that said this is a technical barrier to trade. This is not the way to manage this risk. We should be doing this from a risk-based approach, not a mandatory endpoint testing. So the outcome for that was that we reopened the market. Along the way, we developed capability in Australia for biotoxin testing because that was a market failure in Australia. We didn't have a lab capable of doing that. And we built capability also within the Australian research community to deal with these market access type issues. I wanted to talk about capability from the norovirus in berries and leafy greens event too that happened, because I was involved with that from the SARDI perspective. It was funded from the South Australian and Victorian governments, where they recognised an increase in consumption and an increase in outbreaks internationally and a real lack of expertise in Australia. These are very difficult matrices to work with in terms of virus extraction, so they wanted to have not only a risk profile done for Australia but also to build that expertise. We did prevalence surveys, very low contamination of these products in Australia, and then we started our risk profile, and we found that whilst leafy greens consumed in Australia were mostly produced in Australia, the viruses weren't. The berries weren't. They were mostly produced in China and Chile and imported. And if you look at the prevalence of hepatitis A in Australia compared to China and Chile, it's actually quite low in Australia. So sure enough, in the middle of the survey, we had an outbreak in Australia, and I think you had some in New Zealand as well, all sourced to overseas berries. And the capability that we'd developed during that project was really instrumental in that. Really running out of time now. But when preparing this talk, I scanned what other similar primary industries do in Australia to address these food safety issues. In Australia, we have an RD&E levy that can go against primary industries that builds up a fund of research money, and Australian government will match that with up to 0.5% GVP. So we have some quite large food safety research funds, but they are spread across all of the issues that face industry, and we tend to have a very small amount of that focused at food safety. So below the line, I've got what I call the mature food safety thinkers in Australia. These are people that collaborate really well within their own sectors, and they actually have specific groups that focus strategically on food safety issues. We also have above the line the more less collaborative, I guess, and bodies that have less money for food safety research and are really just maturing in the way they think about that and the way they collaborate. So Hort's a really good example. Recently, they've made massive advances in food safety. They've just joined together in a really collaborative approach, and they're now starting to lead the nation in trying to think about how they deal with their issues collaboratively. We also work really closely with Seafood New Zealand, and that's because we're both relatively small fish in a big market. And we really have got good return on our research investment through working together. So we would like to see this sort of approach extended not just within New Zealand, not just within Australia, but across the countries as well. And when I look at the strategic objectives from the New Zealand Food Safety Centre, there's a really clear overlap with what we are trying to achieve in Australia in that way too. We've been trying to do it for a long time in Australia, and we do have some significant hurdles. Funding is always one of them. And this continual argy-bargy about whose role it is to fund public research, food safety research like this. We also have the federal system to contend with, and that's no small hurdle, I can tell you. It tends to promote silos, and it just makes it a lot harder to deal with this. But at the end of the day, there are a lot of opportunities out there, and if we want to make the most of those opportunities, if we really want to reap the benefits from the investment that we've made in our markets, we need to deal with this. The best way to deal with it is in a strategic way. So I guess my call to arms is that we need less of this. We need to start thinking of ourselves not as competitors, but as collaborators. We need a little bit more of this. We need to work more collaboratively. We need to think more of each other as mates, and what can we do to build that mateship, to take advantage of capability and expertise that currently exists in both countries in a cost-effective way. We have leaders. We have leaders in the food safety space that really think we can work together in this space, that really agree that this is a good way to go.